So this is a reproduction by an art historian, Linda Sheely, and some of her colleagues in Guatemala, of a really important manuscript. It's called the Dresden Codex. And it's one of the 4 surviving manuscripts that made it from pre-contact times and made it over to Europe because people collected it, said, hey, this is cool, and started passing it around. It ended up in the Dresden Library, and it just kind of sat there for centuries until a gentleman named Ernst Forstmann, who was the librarian, found it and decided he wanted to start tinkering with it. So he pulled it out of the collection, stuck it in his desk, and then would work on it just whenever he had free time. And this really set the tone for Maya studies starting at the end of the 19th century, going into the early 20th century, because he found these pages, and you can see them. This is a really nice reproduction because you can unfold it just like the original codex. These pages here all have to do with Venus, and he was the first one to figure that out, that it's charting the observable periods of Venus through a 104-year cycle. And so when he first published this, people thought, oh, this is fascinating, 1. 2, it must mean that the Maya were obsessed with time. And so a lot of what other people started to do was try and corroborate that or figure out what else the Maya were thinking about. It seemed in the very early 20th century to always come back to astronomy. So there's so much published on Maya astronomy, not because that's what they were obsessed with, but that's because that's what scholars first got interested in and first started really mining. So in my opinion, there's a bit of an imbalance just because of our own, biases in terms of how we approach the material, how scholars approach the material. On the other hand, they did do some fascinating things with astronomy, and some of it is right here, and it was found very early on. So we can definitely explore both of those.
Thank you. Does there happen to be anything to do with Fibonacci numbers and
not
0, 1 integer, numbers, but not in here?
No. One of the really interesting things about this manuscript as well is it's in a transitional time period. It comes from a transitional time.
Would this be sacred geometry?
There's some geometry in here, always coordinated with the cosmic regions. I like to use cosmic regions as opposed to the cardinal directions because they really thought of these regions relative to the sun's movements.
Anything to do with the Orion Belt?
The Orion Belt is part of a hypothesis that was put forth by a woman named Linda Sheely and her colleague David Friedel. And they talk about the source of creation astronomically represented in the constellation of Orion. But the problem is that a lot of the stuff, when we look at the names of stars or constellations, is it's still a bit speculative. It's really hard to nail down what were the classic Maya or the post-classic Maya views of the sky. We're still working on that. There's a lot of work to be done, honestly. I mean, we think scholars have been looking at this stuff for over 100 years, but there's still so much to figure out.
And we're going to do our best to figure this out tonight. I think we're on, so hello. I'm Donna Lynn, I'm your host. Welcome to Travel Angel, and tonight we're discussing everything Maya, archaeology, anthropology, culture, history, everything. My guest is Professor Gerardo Aldana from I keep getting this confused. It's UC Santa Barbara?
Santa Barbara, that's right.
And you're in the Department of Chicana Studies, and Ancient Mesoamerica is what you teach,
that's
mostly?
Right, so mostly Aztec, Maya civilizations and history.
And we, just as an example, we were talking that many people think this is the Mayan calendar, when actually can you tell us this is the Aztec calendar?
That's right. So it's unfortunate. I mean, if you Google is the main source of information these days. You Google Maya calendar and this shows up more than anything else. But these are kind of common in the tourist trade, copper reproductions of the stone that was found in Mexico City relatively late, early 20th century. But it's this massive stone that's carved with elements from the Aztec calendar. Now there's some significant overlap between Aztec calendrics and Maya calendrics, so it's not that they're completely different. But to call this a Mayan calendar is actually incorrect.
Right, of course, and we want to give people accurate information because, I mean, we're talking about everything Maya. There's so many people, there's so many misconceptions about everything 2012, end of the world, so we're going to cover as much territory verbally and with video and photographs as we can. Anyway, and we are going to be discussing a bit of the calendar, and maybe you have accurate representations of what the Maya calendar is, and
for sure.
From what little I know, what is it? It's like 20-month calendar, or what?
Right. So there's two basic parts. So this is what's really interesting about this manuscript.
And is it covered in this manuscript?
Well,
oh,
that's
good.
what's interesting about this manuscript is that it comes from a time period when one of the counts. See, John Teeple in the 1930s was a chemical engineer who all of a sudden got really interested in Maya stuff, and he used his mathematics background to explore the calendrics. And he said, excuse me, what we're doing is we're really kind of confusing the issue when we talk about a lot of different calendars. We should really be talking about the counts within a calendar. So there's a 260-day count, there's a 365-day count, and there's the long count, and that's upside down.
Oh, is it upside down?
Yeah. It's hard to orient sometimes because it's all images and bars and dots. But those would be the three primary parts of the classic Maya calendar. The long count, which really just kind of counts off days. That's why it's called the long count. And then the 260-day count, which repeats every 260 days, 365-day count, which is like our tropical year, but it doesn't account for leap years. And those three things come together to make up the basis of the classic Maya calendar. The long count, however, the thing that we see represented
Everybody's
with these bars
talking
and
about
dots,
the long count. What exactly is the long count?
that's the thing that fell out of practice during the post-classic. So they stopped using it, and they started using this other thing called the Katun count, which is more strictly repetitive. So that's something that people often overlook, is the fact that the long count that people want to move and predict and talk about as happening in 2012 fell out of use during 13th, 14th, possibly the 15th century. And so if you want to look at the calendars manipulations that come from the contact time or the colonial period, then there's a disjuncture between that and the long count and the predictions that may have been based on it. So it's one of the things I like to remind people is that the calendar itself was evolving over time. It wasn't a static thing that existed from, thousands BC up until the time of contact with Spain.
I heard something that the Mayans maybe decided to make a calendar, and I forgot at what point, but that they were, to me, they're brilliant. I mean, scientific astronomers, mathematicians, scientists, and that they just figured, okay, well, we have to go back a little bit. So they went back, I don't know if it was centuries or millennia, and they went back, and maybe they made a 5,000-year calendar. Is it something like that? Maybe you can tell me?
Those periods are definitely in there. The thing is that in archaeology, you only have what's left, and it's often not enough. So you have to fill in the blanks. The earliest records we have of the long count itself go back to about the 1st century AD, so 36, 37 BC. Okay, so 1st century BC. But what they're doing is they're giving us long count dates that tell us that there was a starting point thousands of years earlier than that.
So they started to keep track of a calendar at the first 1 year BC?
Those are the first records that we have.
Okay.
So that's the first time they carved it into stone, and then those stone monuments made it down to us.
Okay.
So maybe they were actually using this count thousands of years earlier, but they weren't preserving it on anything stone. It was just on paper.
Because it was so difficult to...
But that seems very unlikely, because if you go thousands of years when the thing supposedly started, there was nobody living in any kind of large-scale city, the kind of place where you would need that kind of calendar. So that's a bit of the complication. People would say, why put a starting place thousands of years before you're actually starting to use it or you're actually inventing it?
Well, because maybe they wanted to track their history.
It could be, although even the history that they would have had, if they had lineages, for example, from around the 1st century BC, they couldn't have extended all the way back to 3000 BC, which is supposedly the origin of this long count calendar.
Okay.
So there's this real problem with trying to determine what is the origin of the long count. For my money, and some of my colleagues as well, they were probably setting it for numerological reasons. They probably invented it around that time, somewhere in the first couple centuries BC, and they decided that they wanted to be living in this era that was governed by the number 7.
Why is 7 an important number?
Well, so there are a couple of numbers that turn out to be important numerologically.
The reason I ask is, for instance, like I just had this fabulous trip all through the Yucatan Peninsula, and I was in Chichen Itza, and there's a ball court, and even in the plaza area outside of the Kukulkan Pyramid, across from the Venus platform, you clap your hands, and at least from the ball court, there's 7 echoes. So to me, 7 is some special number. Maybe I'd like to know if you even know why.
Right, and we don't have to go even to echoes or things. We find inscriptions where 7's recorded as having a numerologically powerful meaning.
7 days of the week.
Well, that's 7 visible planets, European kind of style. But what it looks like in Mesoamerica is that they had numbers associated with the cosmic realms. So they kind of divided the universe up into 3 realms. There's everything that's basically below the surface of the earth, then everything between the surface of the earth and the highest trees, the canopy of the trees, and then everything above that. So the upper world, the sky, the middle world, and then the underworld. We hear a lot about the Maya underworld. It's really, we should really think of it as a community of beings who live underneath the surface of the earth.
Is this mythological?
So it's hard to talk about mythology, religion, when we're talking about ancient indigenous people, because they had developed these things independently of what was going on in Egypt or in Europe or in China. So when scholars develop these ideas of what is religion, what is spirituality, they were using those as the template, and then they try and apply them over to what's going on in Mesoamerica, and it doesn't always fit very well. But yeah, you could say it's their cosmology or it's their worldview. This is how they saw the universe. And it did have spiritual or religious meanings to them, as well as everyday meanings. I mean, when somebody dies, you bury them under the ground. If you believe that there's something about them that stays animate, right, if you want to call it a soul or a spirit or something, then that thing would be underground after they die. And you could see then that those spirits are part of the community of everything else that lives under it. So there's bats down there, there's snakes, there's gophers. Anything that lives under the surface is part of that community. And so you could say it's religious because there's dead people in there, but you could also say it's just a location.
What do you think is the most significant piece of information about this particular calendar?
About this document or about
yes.
So this, well, I'm very biased. I've been spending a lot of time on just 6 pages of this manuscript, the ones that have to do with Venus. And I think that's because I've spent a lot of time on just one verb. I have a friend who's a linguist, and she says, you're starting to sound like a linguist, because I went to her office one day and I said, I have a problem with a verb. I guess that's a mark of being a linguist.
And the Mayans love Venus. The observatory in Chichen Itza seemed to be focused on Venus, and in different sites they had temples to Venus, temples to Mars.
Mm-hmm. And so what I'm finding in my own research is that turns out to be a very post-classic phenomenon. They were very interested in Venus for less kind of deep reasons, I think, in the classic period. Most of it was driven by solar and lunar observable phenomena. Yes, Venus was important, but not to the extent that it kind of turbocharged in the post-classic. In the post-classic, you get the much more intimate contact with central Mexico. And then there's this phenomenon of Quetzalcoatl, who you may have heard of, right?
No, is Quetzalcoatl, I can't say it right, he's the Aztec version, and the Maya version is Kukulkan?
Is Kukulkan, that's right. And you can see they're the same in terms of the names, how they're built. Quetzal is the name of the bird. It can also refer to the feather or precious. And then Coat is the serpent, so feathered serpent or Quetzal serpent. And then in Maya, it's Kuk for the Quetzal. That's the Yucatec word for Quetzal. And then Kan is serpent. So you have the same exact conflation of those 2 words to create the name in both places.
Do we know it's his origin?
So it's a fascinating story because we get most of it from the Aztecs.